بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله المبعوث رحمة للعالمين. I wanted to talk about the necessity of correcting what we can call poor fiqh methodology. One of the transformations that has occurred when it comes to dealing with the reality of fiqh is one, the internet and how it is that it has transformed people that were in times past isolated from each other into an interacting collective that really is also disconnected from what's going on the ground. So the internet has become a space in which we're tied to each other, but we're really detached from what is actually going on the ground. And sometimes we get glimpses into what's happening and we don't know necessarily how to interpret. Those glimpses come by way of videos and video calls and pictures and everything of that sort, news reports and so on and so forth. But what that has done is it has shifted our understanding of the local and our understanding of the global, in part, is filtered through this type of internet reality or this type of global culture, which has even developed by way of music and movies and translation and everything else alongside social media. Sometimes that disturbs the way that true scholarship should operate because it gives us a false sense of thinking that we truly understand what is taking place in other places with detail. And then we don't have the systematic principles in place to really make sense of how to filter that information. Right? And that's a discussion in and of itself. But this has changed a lot for us in that the concept of the global community gives us a false sense of reality, a false sense of what is going on. The internet by itself, as a bank on which information is stored, has created the concept of the fatwa bank itself. And the fatwa bank, in many instances, has displaced the need for some people, of course, not the need in itself in reality, but for people. The need to reference a living person of insight and fatwa that is connected to the community. This is where scholarship has taken kind of a switch, because now people have access but don't necessarily know how to filter what it is that they're accessing, right? They have access to other communities and other realities, but they don't necessarily know how to filter that. And then they have access to these banks of Islamic information, and they mistaken that for true scholarship at times. Their ability to access, they mistaken that for true scholarship. So they feel a certain type of freedom, but that freedom doesn't really allow them to understand how to apply what it is that they're accessing, right? In terms of information. and more specifically when it comes to fatwa and everything of that nature. The other phenomena in poor fiqh methodology is not just that psychological issue of not really knowing how to work with this new time period that we're living in, and knowing how to deal with information that's coming to us, right? That's formed, that's generated, that's collected in a different context, right? It may not be applicable to our situation 100%, but it may get us there 75%. But because that person of knowledge that's necessary to be in place to help that transition, to help that translation into our reality, because that person is absent, that doesn't take place. So people mistaken their ability to access 75-50% of information as scholarship and as not needing to deal with scholarship. That's where the general population of Muslims are. The other dilemma is that the students of knowledge, the people that now are getting PhDs even, they are not really cognizant of that reality 100%, and they themselves come from that reality, and what they're failing to do is to connect to the bodies of scholarship that are living, the fiqh councils. And so they consider themselves qualified to be able to talk about reality, right? But they're doing it in a way that is isolated and piecemeal, like they're the ones that are coming to conclusions on issues. And so there's no isma in that. There's no protective force there with regard to that opinion. It's an opinion which is just thrown out, but it's not an opinion that is cooked slowly and tempered. That's why the concept of sanat al-fatwa, the craft of fatwa, becomes so important, because it's not just the issue of just input and output, right? An input of a question and my output is the answer, and that's it. There's a craft that is involved in this when we talk about the reality of Islamic knowledge. It's not just the input of data and the manipulation of data, right? There's a human reality. There's values that we're trying to achieve. But there's a lot of people that are disconnected from scholarship beyond themselves. And so in any sort of systematic, academic, or scholarly approach, there's a literature review. There's a looking to see what has been said before we come to the issue of translation and application. Translation to the reality, application to the reality. And so a poor fiqh methodology is one in which the individual is centering himself or herself and their understanding, and failing to have this contextual consciousness in place, this problem of how it is that we're dealing with knowledge in today's time, and then the issue of how it is that you work with the research which has been put forward over generations, and then how do you take benefit from that research. But we're too busy being individuals. The ulama in today's time, at the highest levels of scholarship, they operate in collectives because they want to come close to the concept of consensus as much as possible, or at least some sort of group opinion. That's why the concept of group ijtihad has been one which is, or group research has been the concept which has been pushed forward for quite some time. But the biggest problem in U.S. Islamic knowledge culture is this importance of the individual, and this lack of a collective effort, and this lack of being able to have continuity in research and so on and so forth. I'm not one that is against ijtihad, right? But I am one that is against individualism and limitation in terms of insight, because of failing to be part of a collective of scholarship. So people are reinventing the wheel in many instances and making mistakes and talking without any real basis. And we don't see that that's the way of scholarship. The way of scholarship is a referencing of principles, A way of scholarship is a noting of the output of research that went before. It is looking at the variables on the ground, the specifics of individual needs. There's a whole craft, etiquette, and sets of procedures and so on and so forth that are there to guide the whole process of the development of fiqh. And that's missing. Many people have not even clarified what is their methodological approaches in dealing with these issues. And so then that's where we begin to question the type of output that we're seeing. Poor fiqh methodologies. Right? And there's a lot to be said, in this regard. This is one input. There's other inputs that need to come to kind of give us a true understanding of some of the dilemmas that we're seeing. We're even seeing people just quote one scholar, their scholar that is in another country, maybe in a village somewhere, and then they want to impose that, on the reality of a neoliberal, advanced capitalist economic situation, basically in a city that has a whole another set of challenges that are not even realized, in that type of village life. And never are those types of distinctions really brought to the fore so people can have an understanding. And so that shows you that some of our brothers, even quoting from traditional texts and trying to just apply them in today's time, shows that they never operated under scholarship. They were never trained in fatwa. Because one of the realities of being trained in fatwa is to understand those types of realities. You just don't quote from a book, right? Or you just don't engineer your own opinion, right? If that's the case, then we end up in really bad places, right? But there's a necessity to be guided by principles and evidences. And there's a necessity to respect the research that has already gone before us. And there is a necessity to understand the impact on people. Right? This is all from the principles of usul and methodological, guidelines. القواعد المنهجية في الفتوى. So we end on that note. Assalamu alaikum.